So let's move on to the next component. Let's say the user item. This is a simple component. It doesn't have a lot of logic in it. Just props, a custom event, and then one method. So we could, of course, absolutely keep the options API here. And you know what? I will actually do just that. I want to make it clear that the composition API is not a must-use and that it is fine to mix and match components using different APIs in the same project. You also might have reasons for moving every component to a certain approach in an entire project. But on the other hand, you could also argue that there's nothing wrong with the options API in such a simple component. So I will leave it here, but of course be aware that migrating it to the composition API would also be fine. But with that, I'm done with users. Let's move on to UI. Here in base search, we get another simple component. And for the same reason as before, I will keep the options API approach here. But again, as I just said, you could also migrate simply to have all components using the same API in a given project. The base container doesn't even have any scripting logic. The project item.view also doesn't really have anything, just gets a title prop, so there is nothing to migrate here. And that leaves us with the project list component. Here, just as with the user list component, we get a bunch of logic, so that will be the last component I now migrate from options to composition API. So to do that, as before, let's add the setup method here, and let's start with the data. You might know this search term thing. It's basically what we did in the user list.view file, and therefore we will just repeat what we did there. I will import from view, and I will import ref here to manage two refs, and then create the entered search term ref, which is an empty string, and the active search term, which is a ref with an empty string initially. And then we can comment out data, or delete it, of course. Now for computed. There I get a has projects computed property, which basically just checks whether this user has any projects at all. And we get the available projects computed property. Now I will start with the available projects computed property. So let me use computed here, import computed, and call computed here. Store the result in the available projects constant to keep that name. And then just copy the logic from here into the function that we pass to computed, where I'm checking the active search term value. And then I want to work with props again. So we should again accept props here as an argument, as a parameter in the setup method, so that we can access props.user.projects. And then here again use active search term.value, and here again props.user.projects. And with that, I migrated the computed property to this new computed property. So let's now continue with has projects, maybe with the second computed property. I will already copy the logic and then simply create a new has projects computed property by calling computed. And in the function we pass here, I return props user projects and available projects dot value dot length now. Dot value because available projects is a computed property, therefore now a ref, and therefore we get the value by accessing dot value. And now both computed properties are migrated, and we can comment this out as well. Update search is a function we have to add, so that should be pretty straightforward. Function update search, where I simply update entered search term dot value and set it equal to val. And then last but not least, I have my watcher here, where I again will copy this logic. I got a second watcher thereafter as well, but I'll start with this first one. So copy that logic, import watch from view, and then add the watcher maybe here below the computed properties. Add this watcher add this function with that watcher logic and add entered search term as a dependency, because in the end, it's the value of the entered search term we're interested in. And here I want to compare the new value to my entered search term value. So it's the same logic as in the user list component, and update the active search term value whenever that changed. And just in case you're wondering, active search term isn't a dependency here because changes in active search term shouldn't trigger this watcher. And then I got a second watcher here, this one where I basically reset the entered search term whenever we got a new user. So here I'm watching the user prop. And I'm doing this so that if I just searched here, let's say, and I switch users, I reset that and show all the projects of the newly selected user. So that's why I have this watcher, and therefore I'll copy that watcher logic and add a new watcher function here. And the watcher function holds that logic, of course, where I set entered search term.value, but now the dependency is of course not entered search term, but as before, my user prop. Now here you could do props.user, but this would not work, as you will see. But let's try this first, and then I'll explain why this won't work. And now let's comment out the watcher and save everything. And now, of course, expose with return to the template what we need in the template. Because right now we're getting an error that some things are missing or are not being used. Now in the template, we absolutely need our user, this user prop, and that will be available automatically. We don't need to expose it because props which you assign here are automatically available in the template. That logic doesn't change. So you don't need to expose props here. But we need to expose has projects, the update search function, the entered search term, the available projects. Yeah, that should be the things we need to expose. So the entered search term, available projects, has projects, and update search. And with that, I'm getting val is not defined and an unnecessary semicolon. Yeah, here in this watcher, I renamed the argument to new value, something you don't have to do, but since I did it, I should also rename it here. Reformat everything to get rid of that extra semicolon, which I have somewhere. And now this loads. But now I'm getting an error or a warning here. Invalid watch source, null. And that is coming from the watcher where I watch my user. I mentioned that this wouldn't work. The problem with drilling into props here to access the user is that we're basically drilling into a reactive object to then watch a non-reactive value. Initially, user is null because initially no user is selected. And now we're watching null, which makes no sense to view. Instead, we need to watch something reactive, a ref or a reactive object. Props is a reactive object, but just as we had it before in the module, the values inside of props are not reactive, are not refs. And therefore, we should watch props as a whole here. And if we do this and reload, now that works. Now, of course, here that's fine because we only have one prop. But if you had multiple props and they could change, the problem you would have is that your watcher runs whenever any prop changes, not just the user prop. So if you would want to handle this, which again is not necessary here because we only have one prop, but if you would want to be sure that only changes in user trigger this watcher, you could use a feature provided by Vue. We can use the toRefs function, which we also saw earlier in this module in this optional deep dive, reactivity deep dive lecture. We can call toRefs on props, and now we got our props with refs object, you could say. And from there, we can extract our user like this, or with a bit of a more modern, shorter syntax using object destructuring, like this. This will pull out the user key from that props object, and now, because of two refs, that will be a ref, and it will then store this in a constant of the same name. And now we could add user as a dependency here, which now, thanks to two refs, will be a ref. That is the alternative if you don't want to watch all props, but just one prop. It's a bit advanced, but I hope it's clear why we're doing this. With that, if I reload, this works. I can switch to different users. Searching here works. Resetting, if I switch the user, also works. And with that, overall, it looks like we're able to, well, make this app work. And it looks like we migrated this app successfully from the Options API to the Composition API. And that hopefully does not just show you why the Composition API might be better, especially for large components like user list, but it also hopefully now helps you understand how the Composition API works and how you can use it in your next projects if you want to. I just want to come back to one thing real quick, and that is this second argument for using the Composition API. I mentioned that reusing logic across components can be tricky or cumbersome and could be easier when using the Composition API. Well, this is something we're not going to have a look at in this module, but instead in the next module, which will be about reusing code and logic in general, not just with the Composition API, but also still with the Options API, because the Composition API is just an alternative, not a must use.